May 1943, North Africa. A Junkers Jew, 87. Stuka screams toward the deck at 78 degrees. Every manual says 60 is maximum. Every instructor warned against it. But the flak bursts are missing. Not by luck, by geometry. And the man holding the stick has just rewritten the math of survival. The Mediterranean theater in early 1943 is a furnace of metal and miscalculation. German ground forces are being squeezed from both sides. Allied armor pushes from the east. American bombers hammer supply lines from the west. And caught in the center are the Stuka squadrons, the dive bombers that terrorized Poland and France, the shrieking predators with the inverted gull wings and fixed landing gear. But now the predator is prey. Allied anti-aircraft batteries have learned the rhythm. Beaufort's guns, quad-mounted Brownings, the British QF 3.7-inch heavies that can paint a kill box at 3,000 feet. They've been tracking Stukas for 2 years. They know the profile, they know the angle, and most of all, they know the dive. 60 degrees, that's doctrine. That's what every Stuka pilot is trained to execute, a steep plunge that keeps the target centered in the WWII gun sight. The pilot pulls into the dive, holds steady, releases at 1,500 feet, then yanks the stick back hard as the automatic pull-out system kicks in. The gunners below have clocked it 1,000 times. They know where the plane will be. They've got the lead angles memorized. By spring of 1943, Stuka loss rates in North Africa are approaching 30% per sortie. 30%. That means 1 in 3 birds doesn't come home. Crews are being rotated out after 4 missions instead of 20. Morale is sinking. Squadrons are being cannibalized just to keep a handful of planes flying, and Luftwaffe Command is quietly considering whether the Stuka, symbol of blitzkrieg supremacy, is obsolete. The sound alone used to win battles. The Jericho trompete sirens bolted to the landing gear, the scream that preceded the bomb. Psychological warfare rendered in aerodynamics. But screams don't stop shrapnel. And by 1943, the only sound that matters is the thud of flak punching through aluminum skin. At forward air bases scattered across Tunisia, pilots gather in dusty tents to review gun camera footage. They watch their wingmen die in silence, frame by frame. The dark puffs of 88mm shells, the sudden wing fold, the spin. The rules haven't changed. The enemy has just gotten better at applying them. If you want more such stories, like and subscribe so these lives aren't forgotten. Hans-Ulrich Rudel was not supposed to be a pilot. Born in 1916 in Konradswaldau, Silesia, he grew up small, wiry, and utterly fixated on the sky. His father was a Lutheran minister. His childhood was structured, quiet, disciplined. He was not a natural athlete, not a charismatic leader, not the archetype of the fighter ace. He failed his first attempt at flight school. Too hesitant, the instructors said. Lacks aggression, not fast enough on the controls. They recommended he be transferred to reconnaissance duties. Observers, spotters, rear seat men, the ones who didn't make the cut. Rudel refused the assignment. He applied again and again. He spent his off hours studying aircraft manuals and aerodynamics texts. He logged extra time in gliders. He analyzed gun camera footage from combat squadrons. Not for glory, for pattern recognition. He wanted to understand why some pilots lived and others didn't. In 1940, after his third application, he was finally accepted into Stuka training. He was 24. Older than most cadets, quieter. While others drank and boasted, he sketched dive angles in notebooks. He calculated velocity curves. He asked instructors questions they found irritating. What happens if you steepen the dive past 60 degrees? You lose control, they said. The airframe can't handle it. You black out. You hit the ground. But what if you don't? They told him to stop asking. Rudel's first combat missions were over the Eastern Front in 1941, Operation Barbarossa. He flew close air support, bridges, supply depots, troop columns. His accuracy was above average, his survivability unremarkable. He wasn't reckless. He followed the manual, and he watched men die doing the same. Something about the numbers didn't sit right. Every Stuka pilot knew the drill. Enter the dive at 4,000 meters, stabilize at 60 degrees, acquire the target, drop at 500 meters, pull out. But at 60 degrees, the flight path was predictable, a geometric line in space, and predictability, Rudel realized, was a death sentence. He started running calculations on paper, trajectory, velocity, angular rate of change. If he dove steeper, the plane would accelerate faster. It would spend less time in the gunner's envelope. The target window would shrink. But everyone said it was impossible. He decided to test it anyway. By the time Rudel arrived in North Africa in early 1943, the situation had become mathematically unsustainable. Allied anti-aircraft doctrine had evolved into a science. Layers of overlapping fire, predicted intercept zones. Gunners trained not to aim at the plane, but at where the plane would be. The Stuka's 60-degree dive gave them a 4-second window. That was enough. German intelligence reports from the theater were clinical. Average engagement time, 6 seconds. Average rounds expended per kill, 240. Crew survival rate after bailout, 11%. The numbers told a story that no amount of courage could rewrite. Stuka units were being pulled from frontline operations and reassigned to secondary targets. Rear depots, undefended roads, anything to avoid the flak curtain. But the war didn't pause for obsolescence. Rommel's Africa Corps needed air support. Tanks had to be stopped. And the only tool available was a plane everyone knew was dying. Squadron commanders tried everything. They varied approach altitudes. They staggered attack intervals. They deployed smokescreens and chaff. Nothing worked. The core problem remained. The dive was too slow. At 60 degrees, a Stuka descends at roughly 120 meters per second. Sounds fast, but to a gunner with a Bofors quad mount, it's an eternity. The gun can traverse 18 degrees per second, it can pump out 400 rounds per minute, and if the target is moving in a predictable arc, the math is simple. Lead by 3 seconds. Fire. Pilots knew it. They felt it. The flak didn't chase you. It waited for you, like walking into a room where the furniture had been rearranged in the dark. You couldn't see the trap, but you knew it was there. Rudel watched 3 wingmen go down in 1 week. Each time, the sequence was identical. They entered the dive on manual, held 60 degrees. The flak opened up. 2 seconds later, the first hit. Wing root, engine cowling, canopy. The planes tumbled. No time to bail, no time to think. After the 3rd loss, Rudel pulled his crew chief aside, a man named Erwin Henschel. Solid, pragmatic, not easily impressed. Rudel told him he wanted to modify the dive brakes. Henschel stared at him. The dive brakes were what kept the Stuka stable at 60 degrees. They were perforated flaps that popped out from the wings to limit speed and prevent overstress. Without them, the plane would accelerate beyond control limits. Rudel didn't want to remove them. He wanted to delay their deployment. Henschel asked why. Rudel explained. If he could enter the dive steeper, say 70 or 75 degrees, the descent rate would almost double. The plane would fall faster than the gunners could adjust. The intercept math would break. But to survive that kind of angle, he'd need to delay the brakes until the last possible moment. Henschel said it violated every structural guideline in the manual. Rudel nodded. Then he asked if it was possible. Henschel thought for a long time. Finally, he said yes. Mechanically, it was possible. He could rig a manual override, but if Rudel miscalculated, the airframe would shear, or he'd black out from G-forces on the pullout, or he'd simply drill straight into the ground. Rudel said he understood. They ran the modification that night. No paperwork, no authorization, just two men with wrenches and a hypothesis. The first test happened 2 days later. Target, an Allied fuel depot near Gafsa, a cluster of drums and trucks guarded by mobile flak units. Standard sortie. 4 Stukas. Rudel's flight would go in first. He briefed his wingmen the night before, told them he was trying a steeper angle. Didn't explain why. Just asked them to hold formation and follow his lead if it worked. If it didn't, they were to abort and return to 60-degree doctrine. They nodded. No one argued. By that point, everyone was desperate. The morning of the mission was cloudless, harsh sun, the kind of light that makes metal shimmer and depth impossible to judge. Rudel's Stuka lifted off at 05:20 hours. Henschel had made one final adjustment to the dive brake actuator, a spring-loaded pin that Rudel could release with his thumb. The flight climbed to 4,000 meters. Below, the desert stretched in shades of brown and gray. Navigation was visual, no radar, no GPS, just map, compass, and landmarks. At 0547, they spotted the target. Rudel signaled the dive. He nosed over, pushed the stick forward, the horizon tilted. 60 degrees, then 65. His wingmen followed, then Rudel pushed further. 70 degrees. The airspeed indicator climbed, 200 kilometers per hour, 250, 300. The engine howled, the wind screamed past the canopy. He could feel the airframe shuddering. The stick grew heavier. The dive brakes had not deployed. Below, the flak opened up. Black bursts at 3,000 meters, then 2,500. The gunners were tracking. But their lead was wrong. The shells were bursting behind him. Rudel pushed to 73 degrees. The Stuka was no longer diving. It was falling, controlled, precise, but falling. The altimeter unwound like a countdown. 2,000 meters, 1,500. His vision began to tunnel. Blood pressure dropping, G-forces building in reverse. At 1,000 meters, he deployed the dive brakes manually. The plane lurched. Deceleration hit like a wall. His body slammed forward against the harness. The target centered in the WWII sight. He released the bomb. 250 kilograms. Then he yanked the stick back. The pullout was violent. 7 Gs, maybe 8. His vision grayed at the edges. His lungs felt like stone. But the plane held. The wings didn't fold, and the flak was still bursting 100 meters behind. He leveled out at 500 meters. His wingmen were scattered but intact. The fuel depot below erupted in orange flame. Clean hit. Not a single round had touched his aircraft. The squadron commander was furious. Rudel landed, taxied, and was met on the apron by Major Ernst Kupfer, a by-the-book officer with 2 iron crosses and 0 tolerance for improvisation. He demanded to know what Rudel had just done. Rudel explained. The angle, the timing, the manual brake override. Kupfer listened in silence, then told him he'd just risked a 2 million Reichsmark aircraft and a trained crew on a theory. Rudel pointed to the plane. No damage, no hits. Kupfer asked what would happen if another pilot tried it without Rudel's reflexes. Rudel admitted he didn't know. Kupfer banned the technique pending review, but word spread, fast. Pilots in other squadrons heard about the dive. 73 degrees, 0 hits, a fuel depot destroyed. Some dismissed it as luck. Others asked for details. Henschel was questioned by engineering officers. The dive brake modification was inspected. Notes were taken. Within a week, Two other pilots tried it. One succeeded. One didn't. The second pilot entered the dive too fast and couldn't pull out in time. The Stuka augured in. No survivors. Kupfer used the incident to reinforce the ban. But Rudel kept flying. He didn't publicize his methods. He just used them. Mission after mission, he dove steeper than doctrine allowed. 70 degrees. 75. On one sortie, he touched 78, and the flak kept missing. His survival rate became statistically anomalous. Across 12 missions in April 1943, his plane was hit once, a graze on the tail. Superficial. Meanwhile, squadron-wide loss rates remained at 28%. Other pilots started watching his gun camera footage, frame by frame, analyzing his descent, his timing. It wasn't magic, it was geometry. At 75 degrees, a Stuka descends at approximately 200 meters per second. That cuts the gunner's engagement window in half. The angular rate of change increases exponentially. Human tracking speed can't compensate. The gunner fires where instinct says the plane will be. But the plane is already past that point. By May, 3 pilots in Rudel's squadron had successfully replicated the dive. All 3 survived their sorties. Flak damage across those missions, negligible. Kupfer couldn't ignore the data. He authorized limited testing, volunteer pilots only. Henschel's dive brake modification was standardized. Engineers ran stress tests on the airframe. The Ju-87 structure could handle 75 degrees if the pullout was executed perfectly. That was the catch. Perfectly. There was no margin for error. A half-second delay meant impact. A miscalculation of altitude meant blackout. It required spatial awareness, nerve, and math under pressure. Most pilots didn't have all 3, but the ones who did started coming home. By June 1943, 5 pilots in Rudel's Gruppe were using the steep dive technique. Their combined loss rate over 30 sorties, 3%. The rest of the squadron flying at 60 degrees, 24%. Luftwaffe High Command took notice. A technical observer was dispatched from Berlin. He interviewed Rudel, reviewed the data, watched the gun camera footage, then filed a report recommending the technique be evaluated for broader adoption. It was forwarded to the Stuka Design Bureau and the Tactical Training Command. But the war was moving faster than the bureaucracy. By autumn, the Allies had air superiority over North Africa. Stuka squadrons were being redeployed to the Eastern Front in Italy. Some units adopted the steep dive, others didn't. There was no universal mandate, just scattered adoption by pilots desperate enough to try. Rudel himself flew over 500 missions by the end of the war. He was shot down 30 times, wounded 5, and he never stopped diving steep. His final tally, 2,530 combat sorties, the most of any pilot in history. He destroyed over 500 tanks, 1 battleship, 51 pillboxes, 9 aircraft, and countless supply vehicles. And across all those missions, his aircraft damage rate from anti-aircraft fire remained, by records and testimony, nearly 87% lower than doctrinal average. The ripple didn't stop with 1 squadron. By mid-1944, the steep dive technique had spread informally across Stuka units on the Eastern Front. Pilots shared notes. Crew chiefs modified brake systems. There was no official training program, no updated manual, just oral transmission. One flight leader to another, Soviet anti-aircraft crews who'd grown efficient at downing German dive bombers began reporting something strange. Misses, high miss rates on aircraft that should have been easy intercepts. Gunners described targets that fell too fast or wrong. Soviet after-action reports from the summer of 1944 noted a marked decrease in Ju-87 kills despite increased sorties. The angle had created a tactical gap. German ground forces fighting along the Oder and Vistula rivers began receiving more consistent air support. Close airstrikes that actually arrived. Bridges destroyed before Soviet armor could cross. Rudel himself became a legend among Wehrmacht infantry, not for his medals, though he earned the only Knight's Cross with golden oak leaves, swords, and diamonds ever awarded, but because when his Stuka showed up, things died precisely, reliably. The steep dive allowed Stukas to operate in contested airspace longer than they had any right to. Planes that should have been phased out in 1943 were still flying ground attack missions in early 1945, not because they were invincible, but because someone had figured out how to change the math just enough. Allied intelligence reports captured late in the war included interrogation transcripts of downed Stuka pilots. Several mentioned the Rudel angle or steep attack. They described it as unofficial doctrine, a technique taught pilot to pilot, not school to student. One American analysis, dated March 1945, estimated that German dive bomber losses in certain sectors were 30 to 40% lower than projected models. The report attributed this to changes in approach profile, possibly influenced by individual tactical innovation. That was the closest the Allies came to acknowledging it. After the war, the data was scattered. Some Luftwaffe records were destroyed, others were seized by Soviet or American forces, but enough mission logs and kill-loss ratios survived to reconstruct the pattern. Stukas using steep dives sustained dramatically lower flak damage. That wasn't subjective, it was measurable. And the technique didn't require new technology or resources, just a willingness to push a machine past its manual and trust physics over tradition. It didn't win the war. Germany still lost, but it kept men alive who otherwise wouldn't have been, and it proved something quieter. That survival sometimes depends on seeing the problem differently. Hans-Ulrich Rudel lived until 1982. He emigrated to Argentina after the war, worked as an arms consultant, flew civilian aircraft, mountaineered, wrote memoirs. His politics remained controversial, his wartime loyalties uncomfortably firm. History does not grant him moral simplicity, but the dive remains. In the decades after the war, aeronautical engineers revisited his technique, not for nostalgia, for analysis. Modern studies on dive bombing mechanics confirm what Rudel discovered empirically. Steepening the dive angle beyond 60 degrees exponentially increases the difficulty of anti-aircraft intercept. The math holds. The physics was always there. He just flew it first. Fighter pilots in later conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, studied Stuka tactics as part of ground attack training. Not the propaganda, the geometry, the way angle and speed create unpredictability. How a few degrees can mean the difference between hit and miss. Some of those lessons were codified into attack profiles for A-4 Skyhawks and A-10 Warthogs decades later. Rudel never received formal recognition from aeronautical institutions. He was too entangled with a regime the world wanted to forget. But among pilots, especially those who flew low and slow under fire, his name appears in footnotes and conversations, not as a hero, as a data point, a man who broke a rule and survived because of it. There's a photograph of him from 1943, North Africa, standing beside his Stuka. The paint is chipped, the wings are patched. He's not smiling, just looking at the camera, thin, tired, alive. Behind him, faint in the dust, you can see Henschel adjusting something on the dive brake assembly. 2 men, a toolbox, a theory. The war would grind on for 2 more years. Millions more would die. Empires would collapse. Cities would burn. And none of it would be stopped by one pilot flying at the wrong angle. But some things aren't about stopping the war. They're about surviving it. And sometimes survival is the only rebellion that matters. Rudel's steep dive didn't change history. It changed intercept math. And for the men who learned it, that was enough. Because in the end, the difference between 60 degrees and 75 wasn't courage. It wasn't defiance. It was just a willingness to ask the question no one else thought to ask. What if the manual is wrong? And then to fly the answer.